So I know that you're tired after a very intensive summer school, but this is the point of summer schools to concentrate your brain so you can learn something. And I apologize beforehand because this is this is a talk on the application of AI and scientific machine learning principles to material science, but many of you may not know what material science is, right? So I apologize for that. By the way, how many of you know what material science is as a discipline? How many of you know what materials are? Like everything, right? Everything that you see is a material, right? So the whole point of so basically every single thing, an iPhone has about I don't know 100 or more, 200 different kinds of materials in it. So anything that you see, any technology that you can think of, ultimately, even you know computer science technology, right? Machine learning algorithms and so on. Everything ultimately has to be realized in a material, right? And I'm a material scientist, I'm a material engineer, and I'm interested in how you can apply these modern approaches to problem solving to solve problems related to material science. And again, I know that for many of you, this may not look like a problem, but it turns out that it takes a long time to develop new materials, right? So your colleagues, in different material science labs at Texas A&M and elsewhere, who are material scientists, discover some new cool molecule or a new material in the lab, and it takes, from the lab until it is put into a device like an iPhone, it may take 20 years or 30 years, right? And in great part, it takes a long time because the process of material discovery is very expensive, right? Okay? So it takes a long time to do experiments, it takes a long time to do simulations, it takes a long time to do the analysis that is needed to figure out what to do next, given some observations that you have made in the past. So this is very expensive, very time consuming, and therefore it takes a long time for materials to be deployed, right? Um, and yet, the problem is that without new materials, you don't have new technologies. So people know that you can do a lot of really cool things, for example, with batteries in electric vehicles that would allow you to have ranges of 500 miles or more, right? There are not many batteries like that. And the reason for that is because there are not materials that can enable this technology. So every time that a cool technology is out there, in principle, ultimately, that technology may not be realizable because you don't have the right material. The same thing can be said, for example, about nuclear fusion, right? Which is always 50 years ahead. That is a joke. But people are making now real progress. There are several startups that are, actually trying to design nuclear fusion devices. And guess what? They have solved somewhat the plasma instability problem using scientific machine learning. Actually, they have neural networks that predict plasma dynamics ahead of time, so they're able to exert control over the plasma. So that problem that was very hard, that hadn't been solved for decades, they're getting close to solving it. And if they solve it, they're gonna get a step closer towards nuclear fusion. But you know what is the biggest problem right now? The material. You need to contain a star in a lab, right? Imagine you have a star, a tiny star, but you have a star, right? And you have to contain it in a lab. It turns out that we don't have the right materials. Actually, I have a project right now. We're actually trying to design new materials to enable the first wall of a fusion uh, uh, nuclear reactor, right? Super hard problem. And I'm using the techniques that I'm going to talk about today, right? So the stuff that I'm talking about today is actually something that is meaningful, and we're using it to try to create or design the new material that enable new technologies, right? So in material science, this was very important back in 2011, so almost 15 years ago. Uh, the federal government at that time released a report or a study, uh, and that study was named the Materials Genome Initiative. Doesn't have anything to do with the Human Genome Project, But I have colleagues who were involved in drafting this report, and they put genome there to make it look sexy, right? Because the Human Genome Project was very famous, everybody knew about it, and one of my friends who is actually was involved in this report, they said, "Oh, let's use genome here because it may look more, appealing to the public." So it doesn't have anything to do with genomics, but the point here is the idea of this report was a call to action for the community in universities, national labs, academia, to try to figure out how do you actually shorten the materials development time, right? And the premise at that time, it was before, the renaissance of machine learning and AI, right? This was 15 years ago. It was before the deep learning revolution of 2015, something like that, right? So it was like 5 years before deep learning became a thing, right? So back then they were talking about data science, right? The statistics, not really deep learning or machine learning. But the premise was um, if you use, if you have a lot of data, potentially, if you have a new experimental technique, new computational tools, you bring this together, you may be able to reduce the time that it takes to design new materials, right? And but they didn't explain. This is a report by the government. They didn't explain to the community how to do it. They just said, okay, go ahead and invent new ways of inventing new materials. And people in these past 15 years, they have transformed the field of material science, right? And it has become like this approach to using machine learning for materials has become so cool that now computer scientists have in their main conferences, that NeurIPS and etc., they even have a material science section, right? Because computer scientists now have found that solving material science problems is cool, which actually is really good for me because then we have very smart people solving problems that otherwise would be very difficult to solve by us material scientists. So, anyways, material science, materials discovery, right? I want to make a difference between materials discovery and materials design. And what I'm going to talk about right now is more related to material design. But material discovery is just like exploratory science. You tinker with stuff, right? Until you find something cool, and then you continue the exploration, right? So it's usually open-ended. You typically screen broadly whatever problem. And by the way, what I'm talking about here, material science, is actually related to many other disciplines, right? So this is a talk about material science, but this is about how do you solve very complex black box problems using machine learning AI techniques. But anyway, material discovery is serendipity based, and it relies on a lot of luck. Material design, this is what I'm really interested in, is goal oriented and purpose driven. We want a new material that can contain a nuclear fusion reaction, right? So that means that we have to have a certain, resistance to high temperatures, resistance to heat fluxes, blah blah blah, right? Resistance to radiation damage, many different things, right? So we have a goal, right? To enable a particular technology that could be very transformative, right? And then we work our way backwards, right? So it's a goal, so material design is goal oriented, right? It's iterative, right? Because any design process, you actually have to do something. You have to query the problem that you're trying to solve. You get the results, and you have to figure out whether that information is necessary to make the next decision, or what if that information is sufficient to make the next decision. So this is an iterative process. Is application specific, right? So when we're doing material design, we don't design materials without an application in mind, right? It's really application. I mean, we're using deep scientific principles, but they are targeted towards discovering something that is important because it can enable important technologies, right? And so basically, this is what I'm going to talk about today. Material design, and so basically, this is what we're trying to do. We're going to try to go from the target application, so particular problem that we have in mind, to a material solution to that problem. Okay, so we're doing inverse design, although I don't really like the inverse part next to design, because design is a method to solve inverse problems anyways, right? So it's kind of like a double negative or something like that. But anyways, so I'm focusing on design, right? That means that we have a goal and we're trying to figure out how to solve that problem. So again, I apologize. Material scientists, we believe that there is this fundamental paradigm. And how many of you took a material science course back when you were, in engineering, bachelor's degree or something like that? Very few. But anyways, so material scientists believe that to understand materials, you have to understand the connection between processing. Literally, you mix materials and you shake them in a certain way. Okay, you increase temperature, you decrease the temperature, you do stuff. It's like the recipe that you use to bake a pie, for example, or something like that. And then, that processing protocol is going to change the way matter is arranged, right? Okay, that is the structure part of this diagram. And then a certain chemistry and a certain structural arrangement is going to have a certain property, right? What is the melting point of this material? Or how resistant to heat this material is? Or how much charge, this battery material can store, etc. Right? These are properties of the material. And then the performance is just some type of metric that is related to the application, right? So in nuclear fusion reactors, the name of the game is to design a material that lasts long enough and that, can be replaced fast enough, because no material is going to last forever in a nuclear fusion reactor, right? So you have to design a material that can withstand the nuclear fusion, reaction. And then it doesn't remain hot from the radiation point of view for a long time. So then you can go in with robots or whatever, replace the tile that is broken, and then put another one, right? So this criterion of, okay, the maintenance cycle, right? How long do I have to replace the wall of a fusion nuclear reactor? This doesn't have anything to do with materials. It's not a material property, right? It's downtime of the fusion reactor, right? This downtime is not a material property, right? But it's ultimately related to materials behavior, right? So that is the performance part of the process structure property performance chain. And the idea here is that we're trying to navigate this path in an inverse way. Now, materials are very complicated. And by the way, there are two main problems. The first problem is when we start from the problem, there's no recipe, there's no constraint as to what material you have to you can use to solve the problem, right? And for those of you who are not material scientists, I apologize, but materials, for example, you have polymers that are like stuff that that you can bend, right? Soft. They don't resist very high temperatures. You have metals, which tend to be shiny, and some of them tend to be strong, and they are ductile, right? So that means that you can deform them without breaking. There are ceramics that are materials that are very stable, but they tend to break more easily. And there are many, many different material classes, right? When you start from the problem point of view, when you say, I want a better nuclear fusion reactor, in principle, it can be done with any material, right? And there's like an infinite number of materials that we could create, right? So that is the first problem, right? The problem is that, when you start from the problem perspective down to material science, the space to explore is infinite. And then the other problem is that, materials are multi-scale systems, right? And to explain their behavior, you actually have to do a lot of analysis. And maybe you can use some of the techniques that you learned in this school, right? Maybe you can describe the material behavior as a partial differential equation at a particular scale, right? But then you have to run the simulation forward. You have to run these models forward, make predictions, figure out how to solve the scale problem, right? I don't know if you saw multi-scale problems in the school. Did you or not? It's a single scale. But like materials are multi-scale systems, right? So any approach towards scientific machine learning, for example, to do predictions of material behavior, you have to consider the scale transition. And there are many, many foundational problems that you have to solve, right? Those are hard problems, but even the experimental approaches to look at materials are very difficult and expensive, right? So, trying to investigate this material space to try to do material design is very expensive and very complex, right? But we can apply design principles, powered by machine learning and AI tools. So we can use design approaches where you define the problem, You generate candidate solutions, you evaluate, and then you decide, right? So these are like the 4 ingredients of any design problem, and that can be applied to any problem in engineering and science, right? You start by defining the problem, you generate whatever solutions you have at your disposal, you evaluate those solutions, right? You test whether a particular solution A or B works or not, and then you make a decision on what to do next, right? So that is the essence of what we're doing. And we're gonna treat the problem of material discovery, material design as a black box optimization problem, right? So we're gonna now go more into an abstract mathematical representation of the discovery process. But we say we have a black box, right? Black box optimization problems are really hard, right? You do not know the function, so we do not know the mathematical expression for this function, right? Every query of this black box is very expensive in principle, right? So every time that we go into the black box and try to obtain a value of this material function, I have to spend $1,000 or $10,000, right? Or more. Okay, just to give you an idea, I have a center, right? I am the PI of a center. We make about 100 alloys every year in this center in an iterative way. Yeah, we're trying to design new materials. And it takes the cost of every alloy, if you include and that's all we do, right? We're trying to discover new alloys, right? So we make 100 alloys a year. The total cost of that is about, $20,000 per alloy, right? It's very expensive, right? So querying this black box is very expensive. You have noisy outputs, right? Because, the measurements are, not really perfect. And you have a high dimensionality of the problem. There are a lot of inputs. There are a lot of things that you can, tweak. And, there are a lot of outputs as well, right? So it's a multidimensional problem. It's very, very, difficult to solve. We have input variables, the material composition, processing, whatever it is that you do to change the material behavior. And then you have the output variables, right? And the optimization goal in this black box optimization problem is to try to figure out what is the optimal combination of chemistry and processing and everything, right? To maximize a utility, right? So am I going to get the best material for a nuclear fusion reactor? Am I going to get the next generation battery materials, right? That can enable a vehicle that, can run for 600 miles in between charges, right? So that is the objective that I have in my optimization problem. And, if this is an optimization problem, this is how I frame it, right? So I have an objective function, that I can define based on the application. Then I have some design variables, things that I can change, right? That can affect the response of the material. And then I have a bunch of constraints, right? Because regardless of the material problem that I have, I cannot make it all out of diamond, right? Because, it's super expensive, right? So there are always going to be costs, right? And you actually, and there are many other constraints. There may be environmental constraints, or it may be that a key element that you need to use in your material recipe is only produced at the border between Ukraine and Russia, for example, just to give an example. That material is not going to be very available, right? So there are many different constraints that you have to take into account if you want to solve a problem for real, right? As academics, we can always dream of problems that are imaginary, and we can just say, oh, imagine that I have a pink elephant that is perfectly spherical, no friction, blah, blah, blah. But that doesn't transform the world. If we want to really do something that is important, we actually have to take into account all the constraints, right? That are always imposed when you're trying to solve a problem, right? And all of you are engineers or engineer adjacent or science adjacent. So you know that innovation always comes when you have constraints. When you say there's no constraint, just go, you can go and buy a Ferrari, right? Because you don't have, money is not a problem, right? But most of the time money is a problem. You always have to figure out how do you do things as efficiently as possible, okay? So if this is a black box, ideally you want to have correlation between inputs and outputs. So you don't want to sample you cannot solve a black box optimization problem where the black box function is a random function, right? So you want to make sure that there's some correlation between inputs and outputs. You want to make sure that every point in this black box function is addressable. So that means that if I say, go to this chemistry and do this thing, you can actually do it, right? Um, you want the black box function to be tractable, right? So you don't want the function that exponentially increases every time that you query it, right? Okay. Uh, Queries may be time consuming, but they should be carried in a finite time. So that means that you don't need, like, you don't want infinite time associated with every query of this function, because then the problem is intractable. And ideally, you would like a function to be smooth, but we have to play with nature, right? And nature is not smooth, right? So you can do some approximations, but these are the characteristics of the black box functions that we're trying to solve. And now in reality, we don't have like a single black box function. It turns out that materials, we know a lot of science and engineering about materials, right? So there are lots of, it's not a black box function, it's a semi-opaque function, black box function, where you have inside it, you have tiny gray box functions, right? So that means that one of these boxes could be a SciML model. It could be some type of like a pin that describes the material behavior at one scale. These are bugs, maybe some type of experiment that I can run. This bugs here, maybe a machine learning model. So we have a lot of tools, right, that can tell us a little bit of something, a little bit about the material space. They may not tell us everything, right? These are not perfect oracles, right, that can tell us everything we want to know about the material. They are imperfect oracles, but we can query them and we can use them. And if we use them in a way that makes sense, we can do material discovery in a fast way. So basically, the techniques that we're using in my group are basically grounded on Bayesian methods. I don't know if you saw Bayesian statistics in this class. You covered some, right? So essentially, we're using Bayesian methods. So Bayesian approaches are very powerful statistical approaches that allow you to transform some prior knowledge into updated, improved knowledge by confronting your model with data, right? And there's a very specific mathematical operation that you can do. And actually, by the way, a lot of machine learning is grounded on Bayesian methods. Actually, almost all machine learning ultimately is grounded, like deep, 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 is grounded in Bayesian approaches. Okay. So you look at, any advancement in machine learning, Bayes theorem is applied at one point or another in one of those, papers, right? I mean, you just look it up. It's taken for granted, but, Bayesian methods underpin most of, current AI machine learning technology. And we're using Bayesian methods to solve these black box optimization problems. We're using Bayesian optimization. Bayesian optimization is just a technique where you have some stochastic model of the world, right? That is constructed, by making queries. And then you make some queries in this material space, and then you feed those queries to a stochastic model. Typically, we use Gaussian processes. Did you see Gaussian processes in this class? In the context of what? Basically, we use physics-informed Gaussian processes. Okay, so that's cool. So Gaussian processes, I like Gaussian processes better than neural networks in the sparse data regime, right? Because Gaussian processes you already have seen in this class have a lot of structure, right? So that means that with a few supporting points, you can actually build a nice, well-behaving model of the world, right? So this is why we like Gaussian processes a lot. And we use Gaussian processes with different levels of sophistication to map experimental space. Gaussian processes, the other thing that are really good is that they already come with an uncertainty metric or prediction built into the model, right? And the coolest thing about this uncertainty metric is that this uncertainty metric is epistemic uncertainty, right? Which is really perfect. If you're trying to explore a space that is unknown, you want to know how much you do not know about the space that you're trying to explore, right? And Gaussian processes come with uncertainty, out of the box. And it turns out that these prescriptive policies that I have here as a cartoon are constructed based on, in great part, the uncertainty predicted by AGP. Okay. It turns out that in my group, for example, we are now exploring deep Gaussian processes, which is like a kind of like a combination between a neural network, a shallow neural network, and a Gaussian process. It turns out that deep Gaussian processes are not that good for Bayesian optimization because they have become overconfident. And then the uncertainty that they predict is very narrow, which is not really good for exploring the space. So we're actually now making the Gaussian process, the deep Gaussian process, less certain of itself to make sure that we can use it for Bayesian optimization. But in reality, pretty much we use Gaussian processes, physics-informed Gaussian processes, right? And we train or we condition the Gaussian processes based on observations of experiments, right? And then we use the Gaussian process to predict the outcome of experiments that we haven't run in yet. And in reality, this is what we want, right? We want to have a system eventually where you gather some initial data, you build a stochastic model of the world, right? Then based on the model of the world, you basically make decisions on what experiment to do next. You run the experiment and then you keep doing this. This is not really an autonomous system, right? A lot of people say, oh, once you have a loop like this, it's an autonomous system. Well, it's not, because you just go, around in circles, right? It's like when you have, like when our kids were little, we would go to an amusement park and we would put them in a car that would just go in circles. They're not driving, right? So this system that everybody says, oh, this is the basis of an autonomous system. It's not really an autonomous system because they're not like, this thing goes, in loops, right? And every step is controllable and so on. But it's the first step, right? But this is basically what we want to do. We want to basically, have some type of system where starting from some definition of the problem, we just basically query the problem and make decisions, etc. In a way that get us, to the solution faster. There are many challenges in material science when you're actually trying to discover real materials. So you have multiple objectives that are competing with each other. So you can never have everything at the same time, right? So things that are really strong are going to be very brittle. Things that are very ductile, maybe very weak. Materials that can enable rapid charging in a battery, right? Probably have very low charging capacity and vice versa. They're always going to be these trade-offs, right? Okay? You never have the perfect material, right? That has all the perfect attributes at the same time. You always have to choose between attributes, so that is a problem. You have multiple constraints, right? So, there are many, many constraints. Some of them are imposed by physics, some are imposed by regulations, some are imposed by economics. There are many, many different constraints that you have to take into account. Models and experiments have limits. So if you have a pin, that pin may require a lot of data, but you don't have enough data to train the pin. So what are you going to do? So these models may be uncertain. Experiments are expensive. There's always uncertainty not only in the models, but also in the experiments, right? There's always error bars in the measurements that you make. Some things that we want to do for materials take a long time. Some things is not a matter of just making the material and testing it. Sometimes you actually have to make the material and then put it somewhere for a long enough time and then wait literally for hours or days or weeks or years. I know of an experiment in Japan where they have been testing a material for about 20 or 30 years now. Okay, they have interrupted the experiment, right? That is patience. Okay, so sometimes these properties depend on waiting a long time to see what happens, and then you have other things like externalities, right? Something happens in some part of the world, and then suddenly a material that was abundant is becoming less abundant, so you have to find an alternative material, etc. Right? So there's always these problems that are not really science related, but materials exist in the world, right? So anything that affects the world is going to affect the way we make materials and the way we deploy materials in technologies, right? So we have this center, right? We have been running this center for 2 years, where we are actually trying to do precisely, to solve this problem of materials design using Bayesian optimization methods. Okay, so we have a lot of people. We have about 10 PIs, 20 students, 5 postdocs, 1 scientist, a bunch of undergrads. So it takes a long time and a lot of effort to do this. But essentially, what we do is we are creating this iterative loop, right, to solve material discovery problems, alloys in our case. This is basically how it works. So we try to filter as much of the space as we can before we start exploring, because the exploration of this space is very expensive. And what we do is we start with some design of experiments. We make materials, right? We also do simulations. So we make materials and we simulate materials using different types of techniques, including physics-informed Gaussian processes and physics-informed neural networks, right? Um, we do it basically. We do these experiments, physical experiments and virtual experiments. And sometimes what we do is we actually have developed techniques where we're testing the material and we have a digital twin. Did you talk about digital twinning in this class? Okay. But the digital twin is just a digital representation of the physical thing that you have, right? And, what we have done is we have trained neural networks in a virtual experiment, right? So we're testing a material like this, we're just stretching it, and we simulate this process not millions of times, like thousands of times with different parameters, different material properties, fake material properties, right? And everything exists in this neural network. And then when we make a real observation, right, and make a real material, then we use this, neural network to back estimate what properties this material has by inverting essentially the neural network uh, to get the actual material property of the thing that we're measuring based on the connection between the actual measurement and the simulation. So we're using a digital twin, right? A digital representation of the actual experiment to infer material properties in real time. So that is another technology that we're using in our center. We use a bunch of machine learning methods. These are physics-informed machine learning methods, right? So we're not using data-only methods. We do Bayesian updates of our knowledge. So we have a model, a stochastic model of the world. We apply Bayes' theorem in a way, right? We update our model of the world based on the data, and then we keep making decisions and we go in a loop until we find the problem. This is material science, so I will skip this part, but essentially we have a very large chemical space and we're trying to explore it. We have millions and millions, probably billions of materials potentially that we would like to make. And we want to make sure that we do this in a very smart way. So the first thing that we do is to filter the space as much as possible. So we use a lot of techniques, including machine learning methods, to filter the space. Um, and when we apply all these filters, right, we use some machine learning techniques such as clustering to make sure that we have a very nice space filling design, right? And the problem with these material design spaces is that they do not exist. They're not simply connected hypervolumes, right, in a grid. They're more complex than that. So we cannot use this like experimental design schemes that work on a grid, right? We have to use something more sophisticated. So in our case, we use clustering, right? So we have a very complex, potentially unconnected, maybe non-convex space in these multiple dimensions. And we use clustering techniques to basically, find representative sections in these hyperdimensions, right? Hyperdimensional space to get started, right? So we have these families of materials that we're trying to explore. And every time that we're exploring this material space, we ensure that we have, representative elements or representative alloys, right? And every color here, for example, corresponds to different clusters. So we break this complex unconnected space into clusters using clustering techniques. It's an unsupervised learning or supervised machine learning approach. I don't know, do you see, do you have any touch? So basically, you probably saw clustering. You talked about clustering in the school, right? So we're using clustering. Specifically, we're using k-meadows-based clustering to break up this unconnected, really weird-looking multidimensional space into chunks that then we can explore. Okay, that's another technique that we use. So we have these methods, right? So these methods are members of the different clusters that actually exist. And then we use material science. I don't make them, my colleagues make them, but we actually make materials, we test them. Here you see a perfect, parity plot. So that means that the chemistry that we want is the chemistry that my colleagues make, right? So what we want, we can make, right? So that's really cool. Uh, and we verify these are details, but essentially, when we tell my colleagues, okay, make this material, you should observe these properties, they check that they observe these properties and they have the properties that we expected them to have, right? So this is not just guessing to see what you get. We're actually trying to make sure that every time that we're making a recommendation, we get a material that can be, investigated. We do a lot of experiments, right? And I think that in this center, we're actually doing some of the most comprehensive studies on alloys ever, right? Because we're focusing, we have like, when you have enough people, you can actually do cool stuff, right? We have like 20 or something PhD students, lots of postdocs working on this thing. We do a lot of really cool things, including shooting bullets, like micro bullets into the material to see how it responds. So this is really cool, experimental techniques. And then we use sophisticated Bayesian optimization techniques, right? Um, so most Bayesian optimization tends to be sequential BO, so that means that you test the solution at a time, but that is very inefficient, right? Particularly when you can make multiple materials. Actually, we can make a lot of materials. You see here, we can make a lot of materials at a time, right? So our idea is to use approaches that are not sequential. Um, we want to deal with multiple objectives and multiple constraints. We also want to use physics-informed approaches, right? So that means that we use physics-informed Gaussian processes as much as possible. When we actually have a good physics grounding for the GP, we use a physics-informed Gaussian process, right? To make sure that whatever extrapolation the GP is making is safe. It may be wrong, right? But we don't want an extrapolation that gives a number that doesn't make sense at all, right? Uh, so we do multi-objective optimization. So we're solving a problem where actually we're trying to grow. Are you familiar with Pareto optimization? So are you familiar with hypervolume? Right? So hypervolume is the volume of the Pareto set, right? Relative to a reference point. And when you're doing multi-objective optimization, the name of the game is, can you pick the next point in your design space such that you maximize this hypervolume the most, right, in the next iteration? So we're doing hypervolume-based multi-objective Bayesian optimization, right? Okay? And we're solving like 4 or 5 objectives at a time, right? It turns out that computationally, hypervolume calculations are very complicated because these are multidimensional integrals. But Professor Xiaoning Chan from electrical engineering here developed a super fast, exact approach to compute, the hypervolume in n dimensions, right? And we're using that technique, because otherwise the product will be really, 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 really expensive. We use multiple information sources, right? So you can use multiple models at different levels of fidelity, or we can combine experiments and simulations. It doesn't matter, but we have lots of fidelities, lots of different ways of understanding a material, right? Okay. Uh, and we combine everything using information fusion approaches. So basically, we learn the correlation that exists between different information sources, and then we construct a fused Gaussian process, if you will, right? So imagine that you have different GPs that predict different aspects of a material. What we do is we learn the correlation that exists between all these GPs and create another, kernel function that encodes these correlations and then construct a master GP that, encodes all these different pieces of information into a unified model, right? We have done this in the context of multi-fidelity, multi-information GPs, but we have also done this in the context of multitask deep GPs, right? Okay, where we learn different tasks at the same time, and all the tasks are connected by some type of nonlinear, by some machinery that learns these nonlinear correlations between tasks using deep GPs, right? So we use many different approaches to do this, but the name of the game is that we don't have a single black box. We have a bunch of gray boxes that are connected to each other, and we connect them using either multi-fidelity approaches, multitask, like simple linear multitask GPs, or deep Gaussian process multitasking, right? But we use these techniques, um, and we use them actually because it turns out that properties are correlated, right? If I measure one property, I can infer another property by learning this connection between these two properties, right? And these properties may not have anything to do with each other, right? I mean, for example, I may measure the strength of a material, and that is going to be connected with the resistivity of the material, perhaps, right? Two very different properties that they don't have anything to do with each other in principle, but they are connected because they are aspects of the same material. It's like, if you have different people, you want to be a machine learning model about people, right? Different attributes of a person are connected because they're connected to the person, right? Okay. So you can make this connection. For example, total height of someone is correlated with the length of the arm, right? Because otherwise people will look really weird, right? Like super tall people with very short arms, everything is correlated, right? So this is what we're using in our approach. We're taking into account the fact that different attributes of a material have some degree of correlation, and we exploit those correlations in our discoveries, okay? We do batch based optimization. So in Gaussian process inference, like Gaussian process training, right? I don't know how deep you went into GPs, but you can imagine that if you have just 2 or 3 points and you're gonna fit a GP with those 2 or 3 points, then the prediction of the GP beyond these 3 training points is gonna depend significantly on which points you picked by luck at the beginning of your training exercise. And it will also depend significantly, and if you fit the hyperparameters of these GPs conditioned on these 3 points, the extrapolations that you may make may be way off, right? Okay, because for example, if I have this observation here and this observation here, right, then my GP is going to say, well, this is the correlation landscape. It's going to be pretty much flat all over, and I'm going to make some really, weird predictions here, right? Uh, if I have this point here, I'm going to make this prediction here, right? So depending on which points you have observed, right, and how you have done through maximum likelihood, for example, the fitting of the hyperparameters of the GP, your extrapolations could be very risky, right? So in our approach to GP-based, multi-objective optimization, or batch-based optimization, what we do instead is we assume that instead of feeding the hyperparameters of the GP conditioned on the data, right? We say, you know what, any hyperparameter set is feasible, is viable, right? Within bounds, right? So then we do, instead of doing a single Bayesian optimization, we do 1,000 Bayesian optimizations at a time with 1,000 different sets of hyperparameters, right? So we do multiple, Bayesian optimizations at a time. And then what we do is we just basically say, okay, out of these 1,000 GPs, I'm just gonna then do a clustering analysis based on, the throughput that I have in my experiment, how many experiments I can run at a time. So I basically compress again my optimization, and then at the end, I make a certain number of recommendations as opposed to 1,000, for example. I make a certain number of recommendations that can be realized, right? So we do all these things, right? So we also use Bayesian classification to explore the physical space. We use a lot of Bayesian methods. We actually run physical experiments. And this is basically one nice example of our work. So the shaded volume here corresponds to the hypervolume, right? It's a 3-objective space. And you can see that with every iteration, the hypervolume increases, which is really good. Here on the right is basically where I'm querying. This is a 2-dimensional projection of a 6-dimensional space. And every point, in this animation is like the next experiment that I'm running in every iteration. This is how this plot is really cool, right? I really like this plot because in yellow is the expected hypervolume, right? So this is what Bayesian optimization tells me is what the Bayesian optimizer expects the improvement in the hypervolume is going to be at every iteration. And the blue dots corresponds to the actual hypervolume improvement. And they are roughly of the same order of magnitude, right? this is really cool. Okay, I really like this result because this tells me that I have a metric for deciding when to stop. Remember, these campaigns are like if you're going to design a new material, this is very expensive. It can cost millions of dollars, right? But if I can tell you how much I expect the next iteration is going to improve what you have right now, you can then make a decision and say, you know what? I'm not going to invest $1 million more to improve the hypervolume by this amount, right? But if I improve the hypervolume by this amount, maybe I can invest $1 million, right? So the fact that we can predict how much we can improve a, a material design problem, and the fact that this prediction is pretty much in line with what we actually realize is pretty, awesome in my view, because this kind of like gives you an idea on when is enough, when you have done enough to solve the problem, and when you can just basically say, you know what, that's it, let me go to solve the next problem. I'm going to skip this. It turns out that batch-based optimization actually converges on the Pareto set very fast. And we have done a lot of computational experiments and empirical tests to verify this. It turns out that in this particular problem, right, we actually like here I have a timeline of the history of metal or materials, right, from 100,000 years ago, and then around 10,000, 5,000 years ago, people discovered alloys, right? So it's like 5,000 years of metallurgy, right? That's the history of metallurgy, my field, my discipline, right? In a log scale, right? If I were to use a random search approach, it would have taken me thousands of years to solve a problem that we solve in a year, right? So we speeded up the alloy development process by about like 200 times or 2,000 times, I don't remember. Um, and out of a very large space, we only had to explore 0.15% of the space to actually solve the problem. There's some really nice. We also did some science, right? So we discovered new materials, and we discovered things that were thought to be not possible. So we're not only optimized a material, but we actually did, we advanced metallurgical science, which was really cool. There are other things that we're trying to solve, and actually we have some really cool work in collaboration with Professor Dogaler. uh, One of the things that I mentioned is that we start by defining the problem and then we solve it, right? But sometimes the problem is poorly defined. We assume that we know exactly what we want, but that may not be the case. So we're working on some methods that is like a meta optimization. So we solve the problem, we optimize the problem first, and then we optimize the material then afterwards, right? So it's like a two-step optimization where we optimize the problem formulation, literally what it is that needs to be maximized or minimized, and what are the constraints, etc. And once we optimize the problem definition, then we solve the material problem. Okay, so that is some of the things that we're exploring. And where do we want to go, right? I think I'm running out of time, but I'm just gonna go to the last slides. Are gonna take me just a few minutes. So automation autonomy is transforming, all kinds of activities, right? So AI, robotics, etc., is transforming everything from. Actually, have you seen this? Like, this really cool. There's a company that is building, autonomous robotics to handle, big warehouses, right? And so basically, you have drone, like you have like bunch of, collaborative robots moving things around. I mean, it's just amazing. So every single aspect of our economy is being transformed now. Robots are doing surgery, and apparently they're better than doctors for some surgeries. That's pretty awesome and scary at the same time. Um, you have robot chefs, right? So there are several startup companies that are actually building robots to cook, which could have tremendous effects on the economy here. Uh, we have a bunch of research on autonomous vehicles, including here at Texas A&M. Texas A&M is one of the leading places to do autonomous vehicles for long haul, for example, shipping, right? So all kinds of aspects of our economy are being transformed by automation and autonomy. There's a thing such as a self-driving lab. The concept of a self-driving lab in chemistry and materials, it started about 5 years ago, more or less, but it's becoming more and more important. It's a very small community right now, right? but this community is growing, every year. Most of the stuff so far is based on Bayesian optimization. Basically, you have a Bayesian optimizer that instead of doing things in the computer, it controls robots that control materials synthesis and so on. So there's something that is happening, right? And this is something that we actually want to realize at Texas A&M. So we have an idea, we have a concept of a plan, okay, for our own self-driving methodological lab. So we're writing a proposal. We're going to submit it today or tomorrow, I think. But the whole point is that everything that I talked about that has been done by hand, where we have shown that humans doing stuff by hand can discover new materials in 1 year as opposed to 2,000 years, right? But still, it takes a year. And it takes like 20 PhD students, and it takes a lot of time and effort. And our students don't have time to write papers because they're polishing samples and stuff like that. We don't want our students to spend 70% of their time doing experiments when they actually have to, like, I would rather use their brains to think of new things to do, right? So this is what we want to do. And, we have a nice looking plan for an autonomous lab where we're going to do a lot of the stuff that I talked about in this class, right? But in a real lab where you're going to have humans and robots collaborating with each other, right? And, so that's basically where we want to go, right? This is not only where we want to go at Texas A&M, like not just me, but like a bunch of other groups here. But this is where the world of material science is going, right? We want robotic driven autonomous labs. I'm going to conclude my talk. So, to a certain extent, accelerated materials design can be mapped to a black box optimization problem, and Bayesian approaches to solve black box problems are very, very efficient. We use physics-informed machine learning, physics-informed Gaussian processes whenever we can to make sure that our GPs, safely extrapolate into regions that we haven't sampled yet. We have shown, and it's not only us, many different groups have done this, in different materials spaces, and they have shown that you can actually accelerate materials discovery, materials development in a great manner using these Bayesian optimization approaches. The future is autonomy and automation first, and then autonomy. And I'm really sure that scientific machine learning will figure prominently in any effort to do self-driving labs, not only in material science, but in any other scientific or engineering discipline. Okay. So with that, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any question that you have.
Important in this field, I could not.
So because like the hypervolume in this case is the hypervolume in the objective space, right? So I have two properties or three properties, and I want to maximize one, minimize the other one. So I have to move. So basically, the set of non-dominated solutions to the problem form the Pareto set. And the multi-objective optimization problem is about how much you can grow this Pareto set, how many more new non-dominated solutions that basically are, optimal, relative to anything else, how much of this volume can be improved at every iteration. So this is the hypervolume. The hypervolume that I'm talking about here in this optimization is the hypervolume in the objective space. The hypervolume that I projected here, right? This is the input space. So this is the input space, right? It's a 6-dimensional input space that is projected. In this case, we use UMAPs to produce a non-linear, dimensional reduction technique. So we use a UMAP to project the 6-dimensional space into 2 dimensions, right? And this UMAP approach is really good because it preserves global and local information. But this is the input space. This is the hypervolume of the output space, okay?
You must not use Gaussian processes.
Yeah, so we use Gaussian processes out of convenience, right? And we assume normality in the data distribution and so on. But there may be instances where this normality or Gaussianity is not held, right? So, for example, when you deal with rare events or black swans, or when the observations are really not unbiased, right? So when you make an observation and there's going to be a greater chance that you're going to observe values that are, you know, higher than the mean, right, or the median, than, you know, lower. So there may be examples where you actually cannot use a Gaussian process, but it doesn't matter, right? The same. So you can, and you know, I mean, the machinery is more complicated because in some cases, to do all the computations of the next, you know, iterations, the next things to do, right now, we're solving the problem using analytical techniques, right? Because we're assuming that you have a Gaussian process, and there's a lot of mathematical stuff that you can do with GPs that is easy to execute. But if you have a non-Gaussian distribution, to solve the same problem will be way more expensive because then you actually have to do sampling, right? You have to use Monte Carlo sampling type techniques. They become more expensive, and you know, frankly, the yes, uh, we have thought of using, we have used non-GP based approaches to the Bayesian optimization. But then the question is, if you don't have enough data, how do you justify using something that is not a GP, right? Because yes, the assumption of Gaussianity may or may not hold, right, in a physical system. But in order to test that, you actually have to do a lot of observations to begin with, right? And maybe you do a lot of observations and you realize that for a particular material problem, non-Gaussianity is what you have to consider. And then maybe you can map, after spending a lot of time, you know, in that problem, then you can transfer that knowledge into another material problem, right? And say, oh, I have to assume non-Gaussianity, and then I have to sample the actual distribution, right? Or use, or if you're interested in you know, extreme events, instead of using expected improvement, right, which is about like how much I expect the mean response of a Gaussian process, you know, to move, or how much I expect the improvement in my material response to be. Maybe I use another distribution that is focused on the tail end of a Gaussian, for example. And then you have to use other different metrics to judge whether an experiment is worth doing or not. So what I showed here is just like vanilla Gaussian process-based Bayesian optimization, but we're always working with data sparse regime, right? So in the absence of enough data, I mean, making the simplest assumption, right, is the best you can do, right? Okay. If you have more data that invalidates your assumptions, then you have to follow the evidence and then use whatever other technique you have.
Yeah, and it did some very good things.
Oh, I mean, I am more skeptical of pins than, and just to give an idea, so we are doing some physics-based simulations in my group that take 8 days with 8 GPUs to run, right? How much, like, do we hope to have, like, are we hoping to have enough data to train a pin when it takes like 8 days times 8 GPUs per simulation? You're not gonna have enough data, right? We're gonna have like 50 simulations, right? And 50 simulations is not enough data to train a pin. So I like, you know, in most, like in material science is data is very expensive. So for material science, I think that physics informed GP is way more effective than a pin when you don't have enough data.
That was a cool application. We didn't cover PICP and for tutorial, so this was a cool application. So thank you again so much.
Thank you.
And today he's going to talk about machine learning for geometric data.
Right. Okay, so first let me thank all the organizer for inviting me and giving me my first visit to TAMU. I'm very happy to be here. So as was just said, my research is not exactly in the core area of scientific machine learning. I'm more interested in geometric data analysis, so like working on geometric data. So for that reason, I intended this talk not to be something about one very specific work and going in all the math details and so on, but more to give an overview of what me and my collaborator have been doing in this area for the past several years, which include methods that are not necessarily geometric, methods that are like core deep learning method. I will start with things that predate that things, but that are still, I think, very relevant to that day, even in the era of neural networks and deep learning. And then discuss, okay, what about deep learning methods for geometric data? That will be the third section of the talk. So the first section, I'm going to start with just really presenting what are the problems we are interested in this area and what are the challenges that we have to face when we want to do analysis of geometric data. So basically, I come from an area of applied math that's called shape analysis. So now if you want to be fashionable, it's called geometric data science, but it's really pretty much the same thing. So what is all this area about? It's basically the ultimate goal of geometric data science or shape analysis. It's to extend machine learning method or statistical methods to geometric data sets. So what do I mean by geometric data sets? I mean data sets where each observation is a geometric object, a shape. So I will be more specific what we mean by shape in a few slides. But essentially think about a case where your objects are not really Euclidean objects. They are objects that live in a more complicated space than Euclidean spaces. And so, okay, well, this type of data is maybe not as common as images or signals or functions. They are still very ubiquitous in many areas of applications, in particular the areas that I'm interested in, so namely 3D computer vision. There is very common to deal with data that are surfaces. Each observation is a surface or a curve. Area like computational anatomy and biomedical imaging, it's very often that we have data that is segmented from images that is the form of a surface or a curve. Or also, that's not an area I do research on, but it's also an area that does involve a lot of these kind of objects. It's, of course, shape optimization, where you constantly deal with objects like curves and surfaces as well, and so on. So here, this is just a little bit of couple of pictures illustrating different problems in these different areas. So, okay, so what are the difficulties in shape analysis? So there is the first one, which is that the word shape is a very generic term. It's not very well defined, in fact. The point is that there are many objects that qualify as shapes that you can find in the literature. So it goes from simple cases like landmarks, just label points that you can extract from an image, from a picture, to more complicated objects like point clouds, curves, surfaces, but it can be more than that. It can be graph. Another example of shape data. It can be also tensors and tensor fields, like if you work in diffusion tensor imaging, for example. So all of that is really objects that can qualify as shapes because they are objects that are not really Euclidean data in a sense. And okay, so this is just a kaleidoscope of different of these shapes, just showing all from real data, just showing the variety of possible, the zoology of shapes that you can find in the literature and in the applications. Now, because it will be way too ambitious to try to talk about all of that together, I mean, in this talk, I'm going to specifically focus on shapes of curves, so 2D or 3D curves, surfaces, and also objects that are a little bit more complicated, that we call shape graph. But shape graph is essentially a graph where the edges of your graph are curves, are morphological curves. So these are what I will be calling shapes in this talk. I'm mainly going to be focusing on these because they are among the most common shapes that you find, and in the application I look at, they're the one that we most often face. So for us, shapes will be what the meaning of shapes will be curves, basically curved surfaces or shape graphs. Okay, so now what is the difficulty about doing machine learning, doing statistics on these objects? Well, there's the quote I put in the title of this slide is a quote from David Mumford that said that shapes are the ultimate nonlinear sort of things. This is something that he wrote, I think, in his address to the Mathematics Congress I forget exactly in which year. But what we mean by that is that essentially, like, shapes are objects that are that are not easily modeled as Euclidean objects, or that are not easily represented by functions or objects in Euclidean or functional spaces. So this may sound a little bit paradoxical because if you think about, if you have taken a very basic differential geometry in your math studies, well, you should remember that the way that you define a curve or a surface is usually by a parametrization. So you take a parametrization function that I write Q here from a parameter space to Rn. So here n equals 2, n equals 3 in our case, because we have curves and surfaces in 2D or 3D. And Q is basically a mapping. So there, I won't care too much about the mathematical details of what regularity you put. Let's say you have a Lipschitz embedding from your parameter space M into Rn. That is your parameterization. And M is a parameter space, which can be, depending on the objects you consider, it can be an interval, if you consider open curve, for example. It can be a circle, if you consider closed curve. It could be a sphere, if you are talking about closed surfaces, and so on and so forth. So M is a fixed space, that's the parameter space. And then Q, the shape, Q is a parameterization from this parameter space into Rn. Okay, but that's a priori that's a functional space. We have a function that describes our object. Now the problem is that in shape analysis, the issue is that this queue does not identify uniquely the shape itself. Why? Essentially because from a parameterization, you can apply any reparameterization of your parameter space. So you can compose your parameterization queue by any reparameterization gamma. So gamma being, let's say, like a Lipschitz by Lipschitz diffeomorphism of your parameter space M. And any reparameterization like that is giving you the same shape. So this is just an illustration of that. These are two curves, two parametric curves that have two different parameterization, but the shape is the same. The object, the image is the same. It's the same. It's just the only thing that changes is which points of this circle are mapped to which point in that. And same thing here for the surfaces as well. So the point is that the shape itself is not the parameterization. It's in fact the set of all the possible reparameterization of a given parameterization. So this means that a shape space is in essence is a quotient space. It's a quotient of the space of parameterization by the action of the group of reparameterization. So essentially, we are in a space where we identify all the reparameterization of the same curve. And this is typically a non-linear space in essence, because whenever you take a quotient of a functional space by something else, in that case, it's even more difficult because these are infinite dimensional spaces. This is highly non-linear, and this is really something that cannot be represented nicely in an Euclidean space, at least a priori. Okay, so you could say that all of this is very mathematical, but okay, what about in practice? In practice, we don't have shapes that are defined by parameterization. What we deal with in practice are discrete shapes. What I mean by discrete shapes is that you have a bunch of points and you have a mesh. You can have a polygonal curve, for example, or you can have a triangulated surface. So first, I will note that this is still part of the setting I described before. And these are shapes that you can also describe by piecewise affine parameterization. So this is still shape that you can model by the way I defined previously. But more importantly, and this is really like a key point in this talk, is that even when you deal with discrete shapes, you still have to consider this prime of invariance of the representation that you use for your shape. Again, because if you are given a discrete curve, there is many ways to resample the same curve by shuffling around the points or adding more points. Same thing for a surface. You can have a surface that's represented like that, but if you apply a mesh decimation, you will have the same shape in essence, or so approximately the same shape, but with a very different sampling. You can have a down sampling or up sampling of a shape. And so the main takeaway message for this first section of this talk, and in fact for the entire talk, this is really the point I'm trying to drive here, is that when you deal with geometric data, whether it's like in the continuous model or in the discrete model, it's the same thing. You really cannot completely forget about this invariant, this poem of having the same many ways to represent the same object. Essentially, if you take a shape, just view it as a list of points and then run like any like a generic neural network on that, or generic machine learning method on that, usually things are not going to go well. Your methods are not going to generalize well at all. You are really discarding the structure of the space that you are considering here. So instead, you should really think when you do machine learning statistics on this type of geometric data set, you have to really have methods that are invariant or at least to some degree robust to the way that you represent the objects. So that means the parameterization or the sampling. That can also mean in some cases the action of rigid motion. That's another group of transformation that leaves the shape invariant. If you translate and rotate a shape, that's also an invariant transformation. So in this talk, I'm mainly going to focus on parameterization, but think that in general, you also have to deal with rotation and translation. Generally, this is done as a pre-processing. You align your shape prior to doing any analysis, but it's still something that has to be taken into account when you do shape analysis. All right. So as I said, I'm going to start with presenting methods that are not really like related to deep learning. These are methods that originated from already 20, 25 years ago, which are based on the idea of building Riemannian metrics on shape spaces. Again, these are, I will not call that old methods because they are still very used and very much relevant to this day because they can also be used as part of neural network architecture. So I'll spend my second session of the talk discussing these at a high level and not into too many details because these things are quite complicated to explain in all details. And after that, I will just discuss like the methods that are more based on deep learning, geometric deep learning, and what are also the challenges in doing deep learning on this kind of data. So let me talk first about the Riemannian method, the Riemannian approach. First, why Riemannian metrics? I mean, does it make sense to try to build Riemannian metrics on shape spaces? Well, essentially, it's because what I said is that essentially shape spaces are not functional spaces. They are not vector spaces. But essentially, beyond vector spaces, the nicest framework you can have when you want to do statistics, basic statistics on a space, is the Riemannian metric, the Riemannian manifold framework. Okay, why? Because when you have a Riemannian matrix, it's not only that you have a distance, so you can quantify the difference between two objects, but you have more than just a distance. With a Riemannian matrix comes a notion of geodesics, so an optimal path between two objects, meaning that you can do interpolation, geodesic interpolation between two objects. You can also do a regression. Now that you have a notion of geodesic, you can do things similar to linear regression using geodesic regression. With Riemannian manifolds comes also a notion of an extension of the notion of mean. It's called the Frechet mean. It extends the notion of Euclidean mean, so you can calculate mean average of objects in your space. And you can do a lot more things. I mean, from the notion of mean and the notion of geodesics to a mean, you can also generalize things like PCA. You can do things called tangent PCA. You can linearize your space around a certain the average of your data set, and then perform PCA in the tangent space at that template shape. You can do things like SVM as well, the same kind of approach. To some degree, it is also possible to generalize stochastic processes in Riemannian manifolds. I say to some degree because there are lots of difficulties there, but in principle, it is also possible. So the point is that when you have a Riemannian metric, at least you have, in principle, access to a lot of statistical methods that are well defined on Riemannian manifolds. So this is the reason why in the field of shape analysis, a lot of effort has been dedicated to building these Riemannian metrics on shape spaces. So here I'm not pretending to be exhaustive here, but essentially there has been two mainstream approaches to do that, to build this notion of Riemannian metrics on this complicated quotient space, shape spaces. The first line of approach has been the so-called intrinsic metric approach, which is a sort of direct way to build a metric on the space of surfaces or spaces of curves, which stemmed from the initial work by Laurent Younes in 1998, and that was then developed quite a bit by Peter Mishra and David Mumford and their students, and also in parallel by people in Florida State University, Anush Srivastava and Eric Klassen and colleagues. So I will explain it in a tiny bit more detail in the next slide, but essentially this is an approach that is inspired by linear elasticity. You can think about a surface or a curve as a kind of elastic membrane, and the idea is that you are going to model deformation, like a vector field, like you can think of a vector field as a deformation of this thing, and assign some cost to this deformation that will be inspired from linear elasticity. That's just a hand-waving like kind of explanation of that. But it's kind of a so-called intrinsic or direct approach. The metric is going to be built by intrinsic operators along your shape of the deformation field that you apply to it. In parallel, there has been also the other approach, which is called the extrinsic approach. This derives from the model of shape spaces that was proposed by Grenander in the 1990s, and that was then developed by people like Alain Trouvé, Michael Miller, Laurent Younes as well, and Faisal Beg. This model is more, if you try to take a physics analogy, is more inspired by fluid flow ideas. Essentially, the idea is that now you are going to model a deformation of the entire ambient space Rn, build a metric on the group of deformation of your global space Rn, and then basically push this metric to the space of shapes. So essentially, you are looking at a global deformation, a diffeomorphism that will act on the embedded objects, and then compare them by how much global deformation you need to apply to go from one shape onto another. So this is an indirect approach because you go through defining the metric on a group of deformation and then push it down to the space of shapes. Okay, so I could easily spend 1 hour on each of these models to explain it in detail. So that's not the goal of this talk at all. There, I'm just going to give you a very high-level presentation of it, so it doesn't sound too much like a black box when I talk about example of applications of that. So again, take that with a grain of salt. There, I'm skipping a lot of the mathematical ideas just to keep the broad idea there. So starting with the intrinsic model, maybe this is the one that is somewhat the easiest to understand. So intrinsic model, again, is really to take the direct approach of viewing the space of surfaces or curves, let's say, as a manifold, and then defining a metric on each tangent space. That's how you define a Riemannian metric in classical Riemannian geometry. So here the idea is the following, is that if you take a shape that's parameterized by Q and take the image of that, so that's the object we really care about, the image of M by the parameterization, so that's the embedded object. Well, how can you describe that as a manifold? How can you describe the tangent space to add this shape S to the manifold of shapes? Well, the way to describe it is to think about what is an infinitesimal variation of a curve or of a surface. Well, the way to think about that is to consider a vector field defined on that shape. A vector field that you define on your curve, for example, represents basically an infinitesimal variation of your curve. So in other words, when you have a shape S, you can think about the set of vectors, vector field on that shape as the tangent space of the manifold of shapes at that given shape. Now, what does it mean to build a Riemannian metric? It means that you need to assign a cost and energy to how much does it cost to infinitely deform a shape S by this vector field V. So you need to define basically a notion of cost of how much does it cost to deform the shape by the vector field V at the shape S. So if you can do that, then you build a Riemannian metric, and now it's pretty much classical Riemannian geometry. When you have the metric at each point S of your manifold, now you can calculate the distance and the geodesic between 2 points by looking at the optimal path, the path of minimal energy that connects one shape, let's say S0, to the shape S1. So this is what I'm plotting here. Each point of the manifold is a shape. The tangent vector v at each time t is a vector field. We have an energy that penalizes this vector field. And now by integrating all of that, you get a global energy of a path, and the geodesic is a path of minimal energy among all the paths in this shape space that you can take. So the key question is, how do you build this Riemannian energy, this norm of Vs that I write here? So this is why you have to be careful. You really need to define it in a way that's intrinsic to the object, that's not depending on the parameterization. So in essence, the idea is that you can build that by invoking implicit operators. So intrinsic operators to the shape, and integral or differential operators. So one way is to do it by elasticity. As I said, linear elasticity. You can think about defining norm of Vs as a linear elastic energy that will be induced by this infinitesimal deformation. So that gives you a first order metric. In general, in this field of intrinsic metrics, it's more common to use higher order metrics. And this is pretty much the class of the metrics that is most commonly used when we talk about intrinsic metrics between curves and surfaces. These are the so-called second order Sobolev metrics. They are essentially defined as a weighted combination. The weights give you a parametric family of metrics by I0, A1, and A2. It's a weighted combination of a zeroth order term, which is an L2 norm of the vector field, but with respect to the volume measure, the area measure, or the length measure along your shape. So that's what makes it intrinsic, like independence of parameterization. Then a first order term, which involves the Jacobian of V, again, the Jacobian along the surface S. So it's a tangential Jacobian of your vector field V. And a second order term, which typically involves the Laplacian. The Laplace-Beltrami operator on S would be really the surface of the curve Laplacian along your surface S. And so this defines a family of metric, a way to assign an energy to V at the shape S. That is a second order energy, because it has terms of 0, first, and second order. And so this is a class of metric that has been quite used to define this intrinsic approach for shape analysis. Now, in contrast to that, there is the extrinsic approach. Again, I'm trying to summarize it in just a few slides and to give the main idea there. So the extrinsic approach takes another path, which is not to define the metric directly, but as I said, to consider global deformation of your entire space, the ambient space Rn. So let's say a diffeomorphism of Rn into Rn, bijective smooth map from Rn into Rn. Then build the metric on this deformation group, and then try to push the metric from the deformation group to the space of shapes. So the ingredient there is to define a metric on the group of deformation, on the group of diffeomorphism of Rn. And so this is where we have this model that has this kind of barbaric name, large deformation diffeomorphic metric mapping. So I will abbreviate it as LDDMM. So what is the idea of LDDMM is to define a model that allows you to build metrics on deformation group of the space Rn. And the way that it works is by a kind of physics analogy, is that you can represent diffeomorphism by flowing time-dependent vector field of Rn. So if you're not familiar with that, if you take a time-dependent set of vector fields, so now you have a function v that depends on t and x. At each time t, v of t, comma x is a vector field from Rn to Rn, let's say of C1 vector field. You can take the flow of that vector field, of that time-dependent vector field. The flow is just that you take a point and you keep following the vector field at each time t. So in other words, this is a map that you obtain by solving this ODE, this set of ODE, where you start at time t equals 0, you are at a certain point x, and then you are going to deform to flow the point along the vector field by following the vector at each time t and each new point v of tx that you have. You follow the direction given by the vector field. So this is called the flow of a vector field, and it turns out that with the proper assumption on v, you get a diffeomorphic transformation. At each time t, this mapping phi v at time t is a diffeomorphic transformation of Rn. The interest of that is that because you have this parametrization of the diffeomorphism by a sequence of vector fields, you can very easily assign an energy to the global deformation. So if you have a deformation that at time t equals to 1, that's given by the flow of a time-dependent vector field, you can define the energy of that, the global energy of this deformation, by integrating from 0 to 1 some norm of your vector field V at time t. For that, you can take any Hilbert norm, like a Sobolev norm, for example, of Rn, and then integrate basically this norm from time t equals 0 to time t equals 1. So this is just an illustration of the flow in action, just in case of 2D, where we are, let's say we are in R2, and I'm going to represent the action of this flow map, of this deformation map on the point of this grid. So at each time you have a vector at each point that tells you in which direction you go at this given time. But at each new time you have a new vector field that tells you how you move, and you can integrate basically this equation, the equation I just described, from time t equals 0 to time t equals 1, up to the last time where you have deformed your space, you have wrapped the entire space, and basically obtain this deformation at time 1, which is the mapping phi d that I just described. Okay, so that defines a metric on the deformation group, the group of the diffeomorphism of Rn, but you can, as I said, you can now push to the space of shapes. So there I'm skipping some intermediate detail because it's a little complicated to explain in short. But essentially the idea is that when you have two shapes, you can build a metric between these two shapes by looking for a deformation that will map one to the other and that will have minimal energy for the energy I defined before, for the integral of this norm of Vt V square. So in other words, it means that you can calculate the distance and the geodesic between two shapes by solving a registration problem, finding an optimal deformation going from one shape to another, which is optimal with respect to this energy that I defined before. And this is just an illustration of that by matching two shapes there. That is just a set of points. It's not a curve, but just a set of points where you find the optimal deformation that registers your set of landmarks to the other by finding the optimal deformation going from one into another. And so that optimal deformation, together with the path of deformation that you obtain, gives you both a distance and a geodesic between your two shapes. That allows you to interpolate from one shape to another, as I just illustrated here. All right, so in summary, with both models, the intrinsic and the extrinsic model, you find the distance and the geodesic between two shapes by essentially solving a matching problem or a registration problem. In other words, you to find the distance from the shape S0 to the shape S1, you have to look at for all the paths that connects shape 0 to shape S0 to shape S1, but that will minimize an energy, which is an integral of a norm of the integral of the norm of some vector field at the different times. The only difference being that for the intrinsic model, this vector field is defined on the shape itself and penalized by an intrinsic operator energy, like an elastic metric, for example. Whereas in the diffeomorphic model, the extrinsic approach, you have a global deformation field. It's defined everywhere in Rn. And the penalty is defined via global operator like Sobolev matrix on the entire space Rn itself. But other than that, these two models are pretty analogous in a sense. They proceed in the same way. And at the end, to solve this problem of finding the distance, finding the geodesic, you have to solve typically a large dimensional optimal control problem. This problem can be formulated within the optimal control setting. So here, I'm not going to get too much detail about how you solve that in practice because there has been lots of work that have been done precisely to characterize the optimality condition for this problem and derive numerical methods to solve that. So I'll just point to these two, among others, these two, one book and one paper, if you're interested to go deeper in understanding this comparison between these metrics and how they are really addressed in practice. I will just say that this is at this point a pretty mature field. I mean, it's not to a point where these are just theoretical tools. There are lots of numerical libraries that implement this problem I just described, that find the geodesic and the distance between two shapes. And by extension, as I said in the beginning, once you have a notion of geodesic and distance, you can extend a lot of statistical methods like PCA, like clustering, like parallel transport, and so on and so forth. So that's what a lot of these libraries are doing. I mean, I'm citing a bunch of them, but there are others. So at this point, it's something that we can redo in practice. It has a cost. You have to solve this complicated optimal control problem to find one geodesic, but it's feasible. So let me illustrate that in a couple of examples, just to show like that in practice. So these are not the most spectacular applications, but there are some people who have worked a lot more on real data that have done more impressive things, but this is just to illustrate the ideas. Here, this is just an example of doing PCA. That's for the intrinsic model, the second order Sobolev matrix I described in the beginning, of doing PCA on the space of shapes. So on the left, this is just an artificial data set where we took an ellipsoid and we applied some synthetic deformation, like twisting, like expanding or compression. And from this data set, we did the estimation of the mean. So we can estimate a mean shape, the Fréchet mean. That's something that's well defined in Riemannian manifold, which is basically the shape I'm showing in the center here. Now, from the mean, you can calculate a bunch of deformation from the mean to each data point. This gives you a linearization of your shape space. You can now represent the deformation as the initial vector field that goes from your template to each of the data sets. And you can do PCA in this tangent space. That's called tangent PCA. And by doing tangent PCA, because now we are in a shape space, we can visualize what is the effect of these different principal component direction in shape space. Okay, because we have a PCA direction that will be a vector, an initial vector field that you can shoot forward in the geodesic, like shoot the geodesic that goes in this direction, and represent what is the effect on the shape of that. So that's what these three rows are showing here. It's showing three different principal component direction of in this shape space, and then it's quite interpretable because it shows the effect of twisting. That's one of the mode of deformation that was applied to generate this data set. It shows a mode of expansion and shrinking. That's another mode of variation in this synthetic data. And basically a mode of bending, which is like bending the ellipsoids there. So this is something that you can recover using this kind of Riemannian approach. This is an example doing that on real data, the coma face data. It's a bunch of surfaces of human faces. There we did the same thing. We computed the mean of the data set, which is this surface shown here, and then perform PCA, tangent PCA around that mean to obtain basically modes of variation. And again, we can visualize them. And this is things that are usually quite interpretable. For example, the second mode shows basically the action of opening the mouth. That's one of the main variation, morphological variation you observe in this data set. Of course, you can do that also with medical like a more computational anatomy applications. There I just present one example. It was a simple data set that we did in collaboration with people at Johns Hopkins, where we were looking at trying to estimate morphological biomarkers of osteoarthritis. So we had a data set of control and osteoarthritic subjects. We had basically the tip part of the surface of the knee and of the femur and tibia. So it was the tibia-femur joint surfaces, the two surfaces. We focused on the femur surface here. And there we did exactly the kind of same approach that I described before. Here is for the extrinsic models, the LDDMM model, so the global deformation approach. We estimated a mean, so what we call an atlas, basically a mean shape and the deformation from mean to each object, to each surface in the data set. And from that, we can proceed in the same way as I described before, do some PCA analysis, so morphological PCA, tangent PCA around the mean, which gives you basically a low-dimensional embedding of your data. There's just using two principal component directions, but you can take more. And we can also do classification. Again, the same idea. You can build an SVM model in your linearized tangent space as a template shape, and look at simple linearized VM. The advantage is that you can again visualize the effect of this most discriminant direction. You can see what is really the morphological effect of what is basically the biggest the morphological change you observe going from control subject to osteoarthritic subject. This is what is represented here. And I won't go into the details, but this is kind of morphological variation that are consistent, somewhat consistent with what is known in the morphology, what the effect of osteoarthritis is on the morphology of the knee. So again, this is fairly simple data set, quite small data set. There we had only 44 subjects, but there has been like a lot of studies that have used much larger database to do these kind of things on other surfaces than these. It can be a brain and so on and so forth. There is also a lot of application of this in 3D computer vision. There I will skip quite quickly because I think you don't want to run too much out of time for the last part. But especially with the intrinsic model I described before, you can use these things to do to perform a lot of tasks in 3D computer vision. Like, for example, interpolation between two body pose. So it turns out that the intrinsic model is pretty good at modeling the, if you start from a pose and you take another pose and you do geodesic interpolation between them, for some choices of metrics, intrinsic metrics, you obtain an interpolation that is pretty realistic, that represents pretty well the actual motion of someone doing this exact action. So we did some comparison between this model Bareza, which is not exactly the intrinsic approach I described, but a variant of that, like a restricted variant of that, and compared it to some classical like deep learning, 3D deep learning models on how well does it perform in reproducing the motion of someone. A little bit more interesting is application to motion transfer. Again, going back to the Riemannian setting, one thing that you can calculate in Riemannian manifold is called parallel transport. So parallel transport is that if you have a point in your manifold and a tangent vector, so in our case, a shape and a vector field on that shape, you can transport this tangent vector to another point in the manifold, and that's something that you can use to transfer essentially some motion from one shape to another. And this is exactly what this is showing here. We started from this motion of the guy on the top row here, and we essentially transferred this motion to different shapes. So starting from the same pose and transferring the motion to other shapes, and it does pretty well. I mean, the parallel transport in the manifold does pretty well accurately perform these types of motion transfer from one shape to another. I will just add one last application. I added that mainly because I think this is the one that might resonate the most with what the previous talks about people doing like learning PDEs, so learning solution of PDEs. This was a project that I worked on like in the past 2 years with people at Hopkins, Mauro Maggioni and other colleagues. So this has to do with basically operator learning. We heard quite a bit about that in yesterday afternoon's talk. So operator learning is just a supervised approach where you have a training set of solution of PDEs with different initial conditions, for example, or different boundary conditions. And then you want to train a neural network to be able to extrapolate and find the solution for other types of initial or boundary conditions. So typically, there are a lot of architecture that exists for that, but the classical architecture that are called like DeepONet or MioNet, they do that typically assuming a fixed domain. So you have a domain that is fixed. What you change is potentially the initial and the boundary condition of your PDE on that domain. Now, I was approached by people in GSU because they were interested in trying to generalize that to the situation when you want to predict the solution of a PDE, but when the geometry of the domain might vary as well. And there it turns out that the tools that I described before are pretty well suited to try to do that. And that's what an approach that was called DIAMOND for diffeomorphic multi-operator network operator learning, sorry. So especially the model that I described, the LDDMM model, the global diffeomorphic model, because essentially what you can do is use this kind of registration approach, this global diffeomorphic mapping from one shape to another, to essentially map back and forth from a template shape to every possible variant, like a deformable domain that you have in practice, and essentially transform the problem into a problem of finding a solution of a PDE on a fixed domain that you can then pull back on your transport back to the original domain that you have here. So, okay, I don't have too much time to explain that in all details, but the idea is that we really exploited this LDDMM approach to extend this operator learning framework to the situation where your domain can also vary. So you are, and so the core idea was that we could add an extra component to the typical trunk versus so the functional and trunk branches that you have in the classical DeepONet architecture, and add to that a geometric branch, which essentially contains the parameter of the deformation that you have from your template to your given shape. And again, the LDDMM model is very convenient for that because we can do PCA in LDDMM. So we can have a rich, compact representation of deformation using this tangent PCA ID I described. So you have basically a geometric branch that doesn't need to be an extremely large, contain an extremely large number of parameters. You can compress your representation of the diffeomorphism by using this kind of PCA ID. So this is what we exploited there. And so basically obtain this kind of diamond architecture, which is classical DeepONet with the addition of one branch that represents the geometric diffeomorphism from the template, the reference shape, to the current shape that you are considering here. So then basically you can train these things over multiple different like domains and multiple different initial conditions and boundary conditions. Now, of course, applying this framework, once you have trained the thing, is not for free. To apply it, you still need to solve a registration problem. You have to find what are the geometric parameters to input in the geometric branch of your network. So it's not completely free. You still have to solve a registration problem for each new data, but it's the only thing you have to solve. Once you have solved the registration problem, obtain the geometric parameter of the deformation, then you can plug it that in your diamond neural network and basically obtain some of the solution of your PDE. So I will refer to the paper if you want more detail, but this is just one example of doing that on quite simple, like elliptic domains for reaction diffusion PDE. So this approach typically gives you a pretty broad idea of the solution. It's never gives you very accurate solutions, but you should be aware of that. I mean, it's kind of a common thing with operator learning, but it gives you a roughly good estimate of the solution if you are just interested in the qualitative behavior of the solution here. Okay, so well, I'm going a little quick on that, but if you are interested, here are a couple of selected references about what I just said, like covering the different part. In particular, this last part is in this paper that was published last year. And well, here are a couple of references, I mean, describing these different models, like the elastic intrinsic model and the LDDMM approach. Well, I try to put the one that I think are the most accessible if you are starting in this field, rather than the one that are the most technical. Okay, so in the time I've left, okay, I have 20 minutes, that should be good enough. Okay, let me get to the third part of the talk. So right now I've presented methods that have really nothing to do, except for the last one with neural operator learning, but that are geometrically at least that have nothing really to do with deep learning. They are really Riemannian approach, but are classical approach. You have to solve this registration problem. You have to solve this complicated optimal control problem in order to calculate anything, distances, geodesic, and so on and so forth. So one of the problems with that is that this type of method, they tend to not scale up very well when you have very large database. If you have a very large number of subjects with very high resolution, then it becomes really, really costly to solve this problem every single time, because you have to solve this optimal control problem in high dimension every single time you want to even calculate a distance. So when you have very large database, and when in modern geometric data, this is what we tend to have now, these methods are sometimes can be very prohibitively expensive to apply. So this is why it makes sense to imagine that now with deep learning, we should be able to do things better on these kind of things. And well, this is inspired by what happened for images. And for images, like the introduction of deep learning, well, improved the performance of the algorithm by a lot, but also the speed at which you can process data by a lot as well. And this is in large part due to a very nice architecture like CNN, like convolutional neural network, and so on and so forth, that have pretty much managed to make processing and analyzing images like much faster and much able to tackle the large database that we have now. So so we could say, okay, but why can we not hope for the same with geometric data? No? If I don't have images, but we have like shapes, like curves and surfaces. So there it's a bit of a repetition of what I said in the beginning, but there are again quite a few challenges in trying to do deep learning for geometric data. So much so that in fact it is a part of a sub part of machine learning or of deep learning. It's called geometric deep learning. I think the word was coined by I believe by this paper by Bronstein, Brunner, and colleagues. Well, they said, okay, defining deep learning, like generalizing deep learning for geometric data is not trivial. I mean, this is an area that needs care. And I think there is three main reasons for that. I mean, I'm trying to list what are the main challenges in just like building like nice deep learning architecture like for images for geometric data. The first one is that usually the shapes that you get in practice are shapes that are segmented from images. So this means that you have a lot of irregularity. So the sampling of a surface is never regular when you have an actual data. You never have the same number of points. There is no matching between points. You have data that is what it is. It's obtained from a segmentation. And you have a lot of irregularities as well. It's very common when you take a mesh, in particular in computer vision, that you obtain by taking a bunch of pictures. You have a lot of holes in your mesh. You have a lot of irregularities that you need to be somewhat robust to if you want to design some really efficient neural network architecture on that. The second point is the one that I already mentioned, which is that we have all these invariances. I mean, you need to have methods, again, that are somewhat robust to the change of representation that you might have in your data. And so essentially, you should have a network architecture that embeds the invariances to parameterization or to rigid motion in their construction. And the last point, which is also important, is that unlike images, when you deal with geometric data, you never have like the billions of images that you can find online. The data sets are typically much smaller. They can be quite large, but they are never of the order of billions of examples. It's more of the order of tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands if you are really lucky. So this is something you have to keep in mind, because when you design deep learning architecture for that, you either have to find nice ways to augment your data, so to generate new data one way or another, or you should be sure to take architectures that are not too large. You need to have compact architectures because you cannot assume that you are going to have billions of examples to train it on. So these are basically three main challenges that you face when you try to extend deep learning to geometric data, and that people have been working on quite. I mean, this is a very quite active area of research right now. So I would say there is different ways we can go about it. I mean, if you try to address these issues. One is a naive approach, where it's data augmentation. That's as old as the deep learning itself. Is that you can say, okay, I have data, and I'm going to just do data augmentation. So, for example, downsample, upsample a mesh to add more examples that have the same shape. Now, this is possible, but essentially, this is really relying on the idea that the neural network is going to learn by itself the invariances, which is not in general the case. And you have tried these kind of things, and it's not great doing that on geometric data. It also makes the training much longer when you have to augment the data set by huge factors, because here you have to think that the invariances are huge groups. I mean, they are a group of rotation, or they are a group of reparametrization, which are technically infinite dimensional. So it's not like there is just a simple finite, discrete way of doing this kind of operations. Another approach, which is quite studied right now, is to build architectures that are invariant. So, for example, like graph neural network is an example, or mesh neural network. So there's a lot of research that's going on there. I can point you to the paper I cited in the previous slide, but it's detailed quite a bit. But there is also a third approach. This is the one that I'm mainly going to be interested in the little time I've left, which is the idea of saying, okay, but you could also extract feature representation of your data that is invariant. and then build basically the learning framework on this feature space. Now, this is not a new idea. A lot of work has been done there on training neural network to learn this feature representation. So that's a possibility. But what I'm going to be arguing in the rest of this talk is to not necessarily try to train a neural network to learn that, but rely on mathematical models that are a bit more grounded to design this kind of invariant feature representation of shape spaces. And in particular, there is, again, many different ways to do that, but the approach that I'm going to be discussing is an approach that is relying on some tools from an area of mathematics that is known as geometric measure theory. So unfortunately, this is a very kind of quite difficult area to get in if you are not a mathematician. But it's pretty rewarding at the end. If you manage to get through that, like that kind of abstract framework in the beginning, then it really gives very powerful tool to precisely design this kind of feature embedding I described before. Because essentially this field has paved the way to represent objects as measures and very rely on this measure space representation to do processing of shapes by doing processing in spaces of measures instead. So I'll try to give you a brief explanation of how it works. Again, not the mathematical detail can be a little bit complicated, but I'm trying to give you an intuitive idea of what is really the core idea there. And I'll start with just zero-dimensional case, just point clouds first, because it's a little easier to understand with point clouds before going to surfaces and curves. So if you think about a point cloud is a set of points that is unordered. So it's not labeled, so essentially it's really a set. So it means that as a shape space, the space of point clouds, it's a reunion of quotient spaces. It's a reunion of list of points, of p points in Rn for all p, but to which you have to quotient out the action of permutation, because it has to be permutation invariant. We don't have an ordering, a specific ordering in points. So again, as a shape space, it is already a pretty complicated space. It's a reunion of quotient spaces by the finite group, in that case, the group of permutation. So if you try to directly derive method on that, it can be quite annoying and quite complicated, but it turns out that there is a very natural way to embed the space of any point cloud with any number of points p into a fixed space, which is a space of measures, of positive random measures of Rn. And the embedding is very simple. You take your list of points and you associate to it the sum of the Dirac masses at these different points. Sum of Dirac masses. So it's a dual object that takes a function and that will sum the evaluation of your function at these different points. So the remarkable thing there is that any point class can be embedded in the spaces of a space of measure. And now the idea is that you are in a measure space. It's not great, it's an infinite dimensional space, but still now it's back to something that is a functional space, a linear space where you can hope to design metrics and to design methods that are designed for measures that you can then apply to the point clouds embedded in the space of measures. Now, the advantage is that this is possible to do that with curves and surfaces, and this is where geometric measure theory has given us all the tools to do that. And in particular, with one notion that's called varifold. This was a concept that was introduced by Fred Almgren and William Allard in the 1960s, 70s, essentially. And this is just a way to extend this idea of measures, but for shapes, for objects that are not just point clouds, but that have points plus some direction, essentially. So okay, I'll skip this quite quickly through the definition, but what varifold is essentially it's a measure as well, but it's a measure on the product space. It's a measure on Rn times the space of unit direction vector in the sphere Sn-1. So in all the rest of the talk, I'm going to write V, the space of varifold, so the space of positive measure on the space Rn times Sn-1. Since it's a space of measure, you have to remember that measures are always dual to test function. So any varifold in V you can view that as an object that acts on test function, that essentially integrates a test function. So this is a duality bracket. Mu applied to a test function is the integral of the test function h integrated with respect to this measure. Okay, that's a usual view of a measure as a dual to a space of function. Now, the whole point of that is that this gives us a way to represent curves and surfaces, exactly as we had for point clouds. You can represent a point like a curve or a surface as a varifold by essentially adding this direction component. So essentially, what it's doing, in a nutshell, is that it's representing a curve or a surface as a distribution of the point position on the surface plus the direction of the tangent space at that point. So it's maybe easier to describe in discrete shape first. If you have a discrete shape like a discrete polygon or a discrete surface, you can again represent such object as a finite sum of Diracs, weighted combination of Diracs, where now you have three components for each Dirac. One is a weight. The weight is going to be just the length of your segment of your face if you have a curve, or the area of the triangle if you have a surface. A position of a point, which you can think of as the barycenter of your face, the barycenter of the segment or the barycenter of the triangle, and a direction vector, that's the Sn-1 component, which is just going to be the direction of the edge or the normal direction to your face. So it's essentially the direction of the tangent space to the discrete surface at that point. So this gives us a way to embed any discrete curve or these discrete surfaces into the space of varifold. And this is not just for discrete objects. In fact, this representation is also very well defined for continuous shapes, like continuous curve and continuous surfaces. But if you have a Lipschitz embedding, again, from M into Rn, you can associate to this Lipschitz embedding Q a varifold that I write mu Q, and which is just a dual object that takes a test function and integrates this test function along the surface or along the curve represented by Q. Now, the key property of this mapping is that it is independent of parametrization. And even better than that, it is an injective map. So in other words, this varifold representation gives you an embedding on the entire shape space of curves or surfaces into a fixed measure space, which is the space of varifold, the space of measures of Rn times Sn-1. So this is just completing the picture I gave at the beginning. We had this complicated quotient space of quotienting parametrization by reparametrization, but you can embed it into this common space of measures, space of varifold, and now view essentially the shape space as a submanifold in the space of varifold. Now, why is this interesting? I'll take the last 5 minutes to show you. I mean, okay, it seems very abstract, but in fact, it can be really efficiently applied into and it can perform remarkably well in many tasks. Is that now you can say, okay, I'm going to do the learning, all the machine learning, not on my shape space, which is this very complicated quotient space where like you have to define Riemannian metrics that are like kind of tricky. Rather, I'm going to do just machine learning on measure space. Okay, it's not a simple space, but it's a functional space now. So dual space, spaces of function. And just to give you one very simple illustration, one thing you can do, and what is remarkable is that this is maybe the simplest like shape classification regression technique I'm presenting here in the entire talk. And yet it's actually one of the last one we came up with. And this is a very recent work, but we are still finishing the preprint on that. But you can do SVM, for example. You are in measure space. You can say, okay, why can I not just take, I want to learn a function on my varifold space, where I could just learn an affine function on the varifold space. Now, varifold is a dual to spaces of continuous function. So how can you model an affine function on space of varifold? You can just take the evaluation of the varifold against the test function h, and then plus a bias beta. That's very much like an SVM. An SVM in Euclidean space, that's exactly what you will have. Here, you just do SVM, but in the space of varifold. And you rely on the embedding, the fact that you can embed shapes into varifold space to basically do that in the space of varifold. And so now you can design very simple regression and classification method on shapes by just training. Essentially, you want to learn the function h and learn the bias beta. How do you do that? Well, you can define your function h via a neural network, for example. So then you have a bunch of trainable weights that represent this test function h. But again, the key thing here is that we're representing a function in low dimension. It's just a function Rn times Sn-1. So at most, it's like a 5-dimensional space. And okay, we want to learn basically this test function and bias beta in order to do classification or regression. So for example, just to talk about classification, imagine you have a database that is made of a bunch of varifolds. That's your data set with some labels that are right yi, where essentially there you are going to learn C function, C is the number of classes, where basically this quantity here is going to be interpreted as somewhat the probability of being in class K. So at the end of the day, it's just training a model to learn C test function in Rn times Sn-1. That essentially gives you this affine separator in the space of varifold. So we have a little bit of theory saying that this affine function in spaces of varifold can already separate quite a lot of interesting cases of discrete sets of surfaces or discrete sets of curves. And we actually really did it in practice. First on the MNIST database. Our MNIST is a very classical thing that is an image database, but we can convert to a surface by doing some segmentation essentially of that. Here, the main point I want to bring here is that the classifications are high, but not as high as the top shelf, like image classification approach. That's not the point here. NIST is a relatively simple database, so even with simple method, you can get quite high classification. But the main point I want to drive home here is the number of trainable parameters that you need here. Again, because we are just training over a set of test functions that are in low-dimensional space, the number of trainable parameters you have in your model is basically less than 2,000. And with less than 2,000 parameters, you can get classification rates that are almost on par with models that are using millions of trainable parameters. So this is really driving the idea that you can really learn compact, you can have really lightweight, deep, like neural network models for shape analysis that are really exploiting this idea of varifold, this dual nature of varifolds. This is another example doing that on 3D data there, where we extracted shape graphs, so a bunch of complex of shapes that are extracted from face surfaces. And we run the same idea, like doing this SVAR-N, support variable machine, as we call it, to do classification. There we have 12 different identities of people taking different pose, different shape, different facial expression. And basically training this SVAR-N and evaluating on unseen data. This is again the result that we get. And there, in fact, we do bit like typical off-the-shelf 3D method like PointNet. Again, because these approaches are not very well designed to be robust to this reparameterization invariance that I mentioned before, whereas varifolds are very much invariant to that. And once again, I'll point your attention to the fact that we get very high classification accuracies, also with very low number of trainable parameters. This is really because we exploit this varifold space and we exploit this idea of varifolds to basically to make the embedding into a feature space that is already well tailored to this kind of data objects. I think I'm going to run out of time, but I will just mention that using varifold goes way beyond that, what I just presented. This was just basically a simple like learning affine function on spaces of varifold to do like the equivalent of SVM for shape spaces. But with varifold, you can do also a lot of other things, including deriving metrics on the space of shapes that are induced by metric on the space of varifold. That's not too surprising because varifold is a measure space. And on measure spaces, you have tons of metrics that exist. Total variation. You have optimal transport metrics, like Wasserstein metrics. And you have also metrics that we tend to use more because they are quite very nice in terms of having explicit expression for the distance, which are called kernel metrics, derived from reproducing kernel Hilbert spaces. So I don't know if this is something that was treated as part of the summer school or not. No, but okay, well, it's not important, but it's just to say that you can define metrics on measure spaces via a notion of kernel function. It's based on the theory of reproducing kernel Hilbert spaces, but I won't have time to present there. I'm just saying in a nutshell. And the main point of that is that by defining a kernel on your base space, in that case, Rn times Sn-1, which you can define by taking product of kernel on Rn and Sn-1, so there is plenty of kernel you can define there. You obtain a norm on the space of function over that space, and because it's a Hilbert norm, by duality on the dual of that space, which is exactly the space of varifolds. And the key interest of this kernel matrix is that you can express them in closed form. If you have two shapes, Q0 and Q1, you view them as varifold, you can calculate the norm of the inner product for this Hilbert norm between them by just evaluating the kernel function over all pairs of points and tangent vector from one shape to another shape. So this is something that is fully closed form. There is no optimization problem to solve there. It's something that you can solve in closed form, that you can write in closed form. And for discrete shapes, the same idea is that you don't have double integral, you have double sum instead. And then essentially, it's a metric that you can evaluate with a complexity that is quadratic in the number of mesh of the number of cells of your mesh, the number of Dirac masses that you obtain in your discretization. So in terms of shape metric, it's as good as it can be. I mean, there is no optimization. It's quadratic in the board. It's still a bit computationally expensive, but it's not like anywhere near the Riemannian metrics I presented before, where you have to solve complicated optimization problem. So of course, like the caveat to that is that these metrics are not Riemannian metrics. So you don't have any notion of geodesic. You cannot do like simple PCA or stuff like that directly using these metrics because these metrics are just metrics in measure spaces. They are metrics in a very much bigger space than the space of shapes. But they can be used as data attachment terms. They are very efficient kind of cost. If you want to use that as a loss function, just to have a discrepancy measure between one surface and another surface, for example. And this is really the context that these metrics have been used a lot as essentially loss functions for reconstruction problem and for registration problem. You can also do a shape compression using this metric. That's what I'm illustrating with these shapes here. If you have a very large mesh, you can compress it in the space of varifold using these metrics with just a very few number of Dirac masses, so that you have a way to basically do compressed representations. And you can use that to design latent space embedding that are invariant to parameterization. So I think I'm a bit out of time, so maybe I should really skip through that very quick. But the point is that, okay, using these varifold metrics, we have proposed, in fact, it's my postdoc who proposed that in the first place, and now we are currently trying to study it in a bit more details. You can derive like a latent space embedding, a feature space representation of surfaces that is based on the gradient of the varifold distance. Here, the idea in a nutshell is that you can take a reference shape, compute the gradient of the varifold distance from this shape to any other shape in your data set. That's the gradient with respect to the position of the template object. That gives you a vector field defined on your reference object. And now that gives you a way to normalize your representation. Essentially, you can represent any surface as just a vector field on a fixed object, so that is a fixed finite dimensional feature space representation, which, because the variable framework is invariant to parameterization and all these robustness properties, this extends to this variable representation. So there, this is just an example showing that for 3 different surfaces, it's the same shape, but there is well, it's not easy to see on this plots here, but this shape is 10 times downsample from that one. This shape has a bunch of holes everywhere. There is topological nodes all across the surface. Well, you can see that the variable representation, this gradient of the variable distance, is extremely robust to that. Essentially, there is almost no way to visually see the difference between these different latent space representation for these different objects, because it's really invariant to the way that you represent the shape itself. And so, okay, we have used that to build autoencoders for shape reconstruction. I will skip that quickly, but essentially using this variable architecture and using varifold metric as a loss function when you train the reconstruction algorithm, you can build, shape reconstruction thing. So basically, it's like shape denoising. You have a shape that is messy, and you want to obtain a shape that is a clean version of that with a fixed mesh structure. We can solve this problem very well using this kind of variable architecture as a first layer of an autoencoder, which then allows you to inherit all this nice robustness and invariance property when you go downstream in the autoencoder. All right. I think I've talked too much, so I'm not very fond of conclusion slide, but I will just conclude this section by driving the main point, which is that when you want to perform geometric deep learning, so deep learning on geometric data, well, there are many ways to do it, but one approach is to try to find invariant feature representation of the objects. And what I've been trying to draw, the point I've been trying to drive there is that this idea from geometric measure theory, representing a shape as a measure, are very powerful to do this kind of things. And I've tried to show that in different contexts. But this is one approach that I think is pretty promising to try to design more robust deep learning architecture tailored to the kind of geometric data, curve and surfaces, or shape graph that I've been talking about there. So these are, again, a list of references that are covering the different parts of this third section of the talk, if you are interested. But okay, some of them, the last one is not yet, on the SVM approach is not yet there, but I'm hoping we get the preprint relatively soon. So okay, if you can stay tuned, I think within maybe a few weeks we should be online in archive. Okay, well, thank you very much, and I think I'll stop here. Yeah. But these are images, basically, right? Oh, sorry, or what? But what is the format? It's like a curve, because these things are really, at least what I work on is mainly objects that are curved surfaces. For images, you have similar problem with images, by the way. When you want to design an image thing, you at least one invariance you want to have is invariance to sampling, for example. If you don't sample up sample, you should have architecture that are still reasonably robust to that. But so geometrical data, I don't know very well, so I don't know if I can answer. I've not really done anything in this direction. Technically, the least example I showed is that if you can extract like a surface, like you can take the height map and then extract a surface on that, technically you could apply the same strategy. I'm just a little cautious in trying to apply like geometric methods for images, because images, there are already very efficient techniques that can work on images. So in this case, it's not so clear to me what is the advantage of going into all the pain of extracting a geometric data, like a surface or a curve, to then apply the method that I described here. It might work, but there it's not so clear, because you have already like methods that are built on 4 images that are already pretty efficient to. Again, I don't know for geological data because it's really not my area at all. But so I don't know. Maybe technically. Like the thing I would say is that this varifold thing is a very generic, it's a very general like setting. A varifold, it's a very big space that can model lots of different objects beyond even curves and surfaces that I described before. For example, one area where I think there could be some use is the area of diffusion MRI. That's a thing that I know a little bit more, where you measure at each point, you measure a probability distribution of the diffusion of water molecule in all the possible directions. This kind of object is really much a varifold like I described it. It's a distribution of points plus measure on the entire sphere of directions. So there, I think these are very large data sets. It's an image, it's a full image of, it's an image on Rn times Sn-1. So typically they are like using this varifold ID for that. I think there is some promise there. I didn't do it, but this is kind of one direction I'd be interested in going, because I've worked in this kind of data in the past in different contexts. And Now for theoretical data, I'm sorry, I can't really say much because I will have to know exactly what kind of data you're talking about. But yeah.
So I want to get the initial and the final.
No, the vector field is a control here. Really, you have to think about it as a control. The vector field, this V here, is really the control of your problem. So it's not constant. It's like you are trying to estimate it in a way. It's constant neither in space nor in time. In fact, it's a time-dependent thing. So it's an optimal control point on the space of vector field. Now, what I didn't say, because there it would take me quite far, I can say it very quick, is that when you write the condition of optimality, if you have done optimal control, this is something that should not be too surprising, but you can reduce basically the solution. Because it has to satisfy some optimality condition. What you can show, in fact, is the entire geodesic, any geodesic, is only dependent on the initial vector field. It's like in physics. If you throw a stone, if you give me the initial momenta, I can shoot the trajectory all the way through because it satisfies the optimality condition of minimizing the Hamiltonian of the problem. And there, it's exactly the same thing. There is also an Hamiltonian formulation of that. That's how basically we solve this problem. Because if we had to really solve optimizing over a full set of time-dependent vector field at each time and each point in space, that would be an enormously difficult problem. But using this concept of optimal transport, we can reduce the problem to just minimizing over an initial momenta. So at the end of the day, all the experiments I showed there for this model, what you are really optimizing is just the initial momenta, which has momenta vector attached to each point of your shape. And that's really your optimization variable. Now, you still have to integrate the equation forward. You have to integrate Hamiltonian equations that transpose from the shape to the planetary shape. And you have to solve the optimal control problem, which is that you have to basically adapt the position of this momenta vector in a way that you reach your target shape. So this is called geodesic shooting, and it's a very classical approach in optimal control when you want to solve like this type of optimal control problem.
Things like,
Oh yeah. So that's a very interesting question. Our cell growth, to some degree, the problem with this approach that is obvious is we are generating diffeomorphic transformation for the extrinsic model. So cell growth, if you want to model cell division, for example, that you are never going to be able to do that with that. It's not a diffeomorphic transformation. You have to model something that is a change of topology. So that's a key property. None of the extrinsic approach cannot model changes of topology. It's a diffeomorphic. You have a diffeomorphic transformation of your space. This cannot modify the topology of your object. The extrinsic model can change it to a certain degree. In the extrinsic approach, you can create self-intersection, but you cannot really divide an object into two pieces. So for that, you have to go for higher, I would say these approaches are not necessarily the best to do these kind of things when you want to model changes of topology. Growth, yes. If you just growth, you can model growth. And I think we have a paper with Laurent Younes where we describe a bit the idea of modeling growth and atrophy using this approach, like a variation of this approach. But if you want to model things like cell division, for example, like mitosis, there you need to do something more than that because diffeomorphic transformation is not going to give you, it's too constrained to obtain that. There are models that are called metamorphosis that attempts to do these kind of things. It's an extension of the LDDML model where you add some extra variation in your object, but I didn't discuss it here. It's called metamorphosis. And in fact, if you are interested, it's discussed a little bit in this. Yeah, sorry, I forgot to mention it here. Well, it was one of the references I gave in the slide earlier, but I mentioned that you're interested in looking at that. Yeah.